Hello and welcome to this episode of How to Be a Great GM. Well, by popular demand, by request, we're looking at the setting of wilderness. Now, wilderness or wilderness travel or travel in general just through the wild areas of your world, of your planet that your away team is visiting, of the fantasy setting that your characters are living in. If we look at the setting of wilderness, it can be a very tricky space in which to play. Why is that? Because it can be an incredibly boring place to play in. Either that or the druid/ranger is busy running around collecting, killing, maiming, sorting out all of the problems that you throw at the party, and it becomes a boring environment for everybody else except for the nature, the woodland individual. So we're going to look at how to make how to make wilderness journey adventures, how to make them interesting so that everybody's involved and that everybody can participate and that everybody can feel as if, well, they're involved somehow. So how do we do that? Well, we look at obviously, what does everyone expect from a journey through the wilderness? Well, people expect travel. Obviously, you've got to move them from point A to point B. So now that gives us a clue as to how we can make it interesting. Now, we'll come back to that just now. Random encounters. People expect random encounters. Well, they at least hope for it in a way of punctuating the story, especially if your story is boring. So we're going to come back to random encounters as well. They expect terrain. Now, obviously, they expect terrain. Well, at least you think that obviously they expect terrain, but how often do you actually think about the terrain that they're traversing through? Or do you just look at it and go, oh, it's a field, you walk across it? Something to think about. We will come back to that one as well. And then, of course, they think about lack of access to facilities. They think of lack of access to shopping. They think of lack of access to libraries. They think of lack of access to basically civilization. Well, you are traveling in the wilderness for a reason. So again, we're going to come back to that expectation. And then, of course, they expect survival, skill challenges, skill checks somehow. They expect campfires and camping. They expect to run out of supplies. They expect to be tasked with sourcing or finding their own supplies. All of these things go together into what they expect. And this is where the wilderness setting allows us to use those expectations to make it that much more interesting and to make our narrative and our world that much more alive. So we're going to come back to exactly how we do that just now, because it ties in together with the idea of the tone of wilderness setting. Now, the tone of wilderness setting is basically there are 4 general tones of which we are all aware, and those are the seasons: spring, autumn, winter, and summer, or fall for the autumn people who like to call autumn fall, when the leaves fall off the trees, I suppose. Either way, it doesn't matter. Whatever you call it, fall, autumn, the 4 seasons determine the tone quite specifically. Then, of course, you've got the actual environment itself. Is it raining? So then it's a melancholy mood. Is it snowing? So then it's a cold blizzard-like mood. Is it blisteringly hot? That's a different type of mood. So the tone of wilderness travel is determined by the environmental conditions as well as the period in which your heroes find themselves. And I think it's important that we keep track of this. Now, far too often, I see GMs running wilderness games or games that are set outside, and they have paid no attention whatsoever to the weather, to the environment, to the season that they're in. Documentaries on wildlife are replete with, it's summer and the feasting is good. It's winter, and now Gnarly must scavenge in order to survive. All of those kind of documentaries focus on those conditions because it determines the tone, and something that you should really look at if it isn't something that you don't already include. I think that makes sense. So the tone is very much dependent on the season as well as on the weather conditions. It's also dependent upon your imagination. Going for a stroll through mountains can be a pleasant exercise. There's some wonderful mountains in South Africa, and there's some wonderful mountains in Japan that I plan on visiting. There's also some volcanoes as well as other bits and pieces that I don't plan on visiting because although they're mountains, they're a very different tone, a very different feeling is established by the nature of the fact. So you must also think about the type of terrain that the people will be going through. Is it thick bracken, which has got hooks and thorns everywhere? Is it pleasant rolling meadows? Again, that will determine the tone. So we're going to use the tone, we're going to use that rather as our deciding factor on how we address everything else that's been expected. Because combining the two together create a remarkably unique and interesting wilderness journey rather than just the boring humdrum. You walk across, yeah, make a roll, okay, you're there. I don't think anyone who watches this channel does that anymore, but if in case you do, these are the ways on how to avoid doing that. Now, of course, we then look at the adventures that present themselves with this type of setting, and there are many, many, many adventures. They are all almost precursor adventures to things that will be happening. The journey towards the castle, the journey away from the ruins, the journey towards the city, the exploration of the planet. So they usually, the setting of wilderness is a transitory, an intermediate space that the players will play in for a brief period of time before moving on to the next environment, the dungeon or the citadel or whatever. Now, when we look at references, there are two films that spring to mind when I think of this, and that's The Grey, that Liam Neeson film about the wolves, which has got a wonderful tone of delightful happiness and everyone's cute and cuddly, or the exact opposite. And then, of course, The Revenant, where again, we've got wonderful survival environments where the individuals have to work. Or you could just watch any Survivor show where you will see people trying to survive in the wilderness and succeeding or not. So there are a lot of things there. Now, how do we use the expectations to make better environments? Well, let's look at the very first one, the travel component. Now, if one looks at the map behind me, for example, this is Braxia in space. This is a space map of Braxia, the fantasy setting that I use. And the idea of how do you get from point A to point B in space travel if you're not using a prescribed system like Star Trek or Star Wars or Babylon 5 or any of the science fiction settings out there, you have to determine how they get from point A to point B. Now, if it's a fantasy map, the same problem presents itself. How do they get from point A to point B? Are there teleportation gates? Are there roads? Are there sand ships that sail on the sand with sleds, such as they have in the Sahara Desert? Are there ice ships that sail across ice sheets? So looking at how your inhabitants get from point A to point B suddenly creates a much more interesting travel option. If your people have to think about, oh, well, we could walk, we could take horses, we could take six-legged lizard creatures that move at twice the speed, we could take those winged things that fly overland, we could take a sky barge, we could take a 70-wheeled wagon train. Thinking about how your population moves around your world is incredibly important, and it makes a wilderness space a lot more interesting if you have these different modes of transportation. If you're playing in a fantasy game, well, 50,000 tensor floating disks linked together creates a rather impressive floating barge, or floating city for that matter. So how the people are going to travel from point A to point B is important. If you then look at it further, or you look at it on an individual basis, there might be snowshoes that they need to get, but perhaps the snowshoes have been enchanted that wherever the individual walks, they walk on top of the snow and they are warmed by contact with snow because of the reaction of the snowshoes with the snow, the magical spell or the electronic processes that cause an exothermic reaction, however you want to play it. So by adding to how individuals travel and not just going while you walk, it becomes remarkably interesting. If you look at, for example, some of the great empires of Earth, moving from point A to point B, there were lots of little resting posts. Point A, point B, point C, point D would be divided into point A 1, 2, 3, 4, B 1, 2, 3, 4, and at each of these little posts was a watering hole. Sometimes there was a little bit of a food vendor selling things. There were horses tethered there because couriers needed to change fresh horses, all sorts of things. So you can think about how the travel aspect is going to affect your game. Now, if we then look at the second one, random encounters. Now, I remember in the old days, literally different environments, different wildernesses had different random encounter tables, and you'd roll to see, well, this is the encounter or that's the encounter, this is what they should discover. They come across a dragon randomly. Oh, they come across 20 orcs. What? Why? They aren't in an area that's got orcs. Oh, so then you'd spend days making your own random encounter tables that you would feverishly work on to make sure they fitted with your world. My argument has always been, why should it be random? Why should dice determine the outcome of whether or not the party encounters anything? You're the GM. You're the GM. You're the GM, man. You're the GM. You are the GM. You should decide whether or not the party encounters something. If you need a dice to determine whether or not it happens, well, that's fine. And if you need the advice of a table as to what it could be that they encounter in that area, well, that's okay too. My argument is that you should know the area that they're moving through, and you should know what type of creatures are in that area and what their goals are. Yes, the table might say they encounter orcs, but if the orcs are moving from point A to point B just as much as the players are, well, then they're not going to attack. They might begrudgingly pass each other, or maybe the orcs circumnavigate, make a wide detour around the players because they're worried that the players might interfere in their plans. So I always look at random encounters, if you have to roll, as an opportunity to stretch your storytelling capacity, to try and come up with an inventive or interesting encounter within that random encounter that the players can then experience, and not just random combat or a creature that attacks and that kind of thing. So random encounters can be useful to making these things a little bit more interesting, but I would always urge you to only have random encounters if you yourself want them to happen. There's nothing worse than having players moving from point A to point B, but it takes 12 sessions because you just happen to roll that lucky encounter number every single time, and the party goes from one murder to the next, to the next, to the next. I don't advocate that kind of play because it's boring. Now, if you look at the terrain is very interesting, and the only way that you can really get to grips with terrain, in my opinion, is if you go on walks. Now, when I was touring the States last year, I went on lots of walks, whether it was walking around Los Angeles or whether it was walking in the valleys of San Diego. It didn't really matter. I was exploring and looking at different types of terrain, even here in Japan. It's a very different type of world to Los Angeles, to Minnesota, to New York. It's a city, it's got people in it, but they have a very different take on things. And nature has a very different take on things. What I did find, and what I do find interesting, is that there are certain plants that I encounter here in Japan that I know come from a different country because they're coming from South Africa. Or they're not indigenous to South Africa or Japan, but come from India, for example. And it makes me smile when I pass a tree or a shrub and I go, oh, I have seen that before. I have experienced that in this environment or in that environment. The point I'm trying to make is that even a little stream can have a story behind it. A babbling brook may or may not just be a stream. If you look at your map, and I'm looking over at a map that I have over there on the wall of Braxia, the fantasy map, that's got rivers and things in it, creating interesting terrain. A patch on your map might indicate an open field. But I have very seldom walked in an open field that doesn't have a mysterious ditch in it, or a mound of termites, or maybe there's some soggy areas that start to turn into a marsh. Just because the map says it's blank space doesn't mean that it has to be blank. It's entirely up to you to add interesting features to it. Now, for me, one of the most important things, and this is the lack of access to resources and that kind of thing, is to look at your players and to think, are they bored? Are they kind of just going along, all right, we walk. Do we have to set up camp? Okay, we set up camp. I take first, watch third. If they are disinterested, if they are just wanting to walk across from point A to point B, let them walk across from point A to point B. Don't include or involve anything else that is required, except if you need to have time for your villain to do something, so you need the party to be delayed, in which case then you can throw in some random story elements. On the other hand, if the party is desperately trying to get to a city so they can sell off some goods or they can buy some much needed supplies, well, why not have them encounter a wandering caravan? Merchants have got to move from point A to point B too. So a random ship in space that happens to sell stuff, well, fantastic. Of course, a ship that is selling exactly what the players need, well, that might be a little bit too convenient and you might need to change it up a bit. Think about it. So having the players have access to stuff in random journey encounters or when they're out in the wilderness is fantastic. Imagine if they came across a library that's been isolated for centuries from the rest of the world because, well, you know, the mage is looking for spells and you want to give them something fun to play with. It's a quick little adventure on the side if you want it to be, and it allows the players to get access to stuff that, well, that they want too. And ultimately, if you give them what they want, they'll be happy. You just give it to them in a different way, of course. Now, the last thing that we need to look at is all those survival checks and the fact that the ranger, the druid, the naturalist, the survivalist, whatever you want to call them and whatever they're called in your game, is the one who's making all the checks and everybody else isn't. So that's where I look at it and I say, well, how do I change the terrain so that it is the wizard who's going to have to use some kind of magic spell to cross something? Well, why not have an area of magic that's disrupting the entire field and that the mage is going to be required to cast a simple spell in order to get past? Or an archway that's got some kind of ward on it? Or perhaps it's just a rather large flowing river and no amount of survival is going to help you get across. It's going to require the brute strength of the other players to form a rope bridge to help themselves get across. Your reasoning is entirely up to you. My suggestion, though, is to try and look at traits and skills that others have that you can make use of. So, like all things, try and include as many skills as possible and as many different attributes as possible to make sure that the entire party is engaged. I hope this little journey into making wilderness encounters or to make wilderness travel that much more interesting and that much more dynamic has sparked some imaginary options for you and will make that next journey across the fields just that much more interesting for your players. If it has, hit that like button. If you want to see more, hit the subscribe button. Join us on Twitter, #HowToGM, #HowToGM. Join us on www.greatgm.com for bits and pieces and some options of different types of games you might like. Otherwise, if you're looking to start your own game or to run a game and or join a game for that matter, whether it's online or in real life, head on over to www.rpgtablefinder.com. It's a little thing that the Web Goblin whipped up last year, and it allows you to search and look for other players out there who are looking for tables to join. So I hope those are useful and helpful to you. And until next time, I wish you and yours the very happiest.